Before we begin this presentation and introduce you to our Patriot ancestors, we'd like for you to go back with us in your mind about 250 years. In 1775, the population of the 13 colonies was around 2.5 million people, and about 90% lived in small villages or in the country. Homes were heated and cooking was done with wood. The largest cities in the 13 colonies were along the Atlantic coast, Philadelphia with 43,000 population, followed by New York with 25,000 and Boston with 16,000. The 5 largest cities had a combined population of 107,000 residents. The city of Dallas now has a population of about 1.3 million, for contrast. To travel anywhere on land, you had to walk, ride a horse, or use a horse-drawn buggy or a carriage. Inland boats were rowed with oars, while ocean-going boats used sails. The gasoline, diesel, electric, or steam-powered transportation had not yet been invented. There were no paved roads and very few bridges. To cross rivers, there were some ferry boats, otherwise you must ford in a low water place. Individual communication was by person, letter, messenger, or newspaper. There were no telephones, telegraph, radios, televisions, internet, or social media. Now, with that background, meet Jacob Van Fossen and Elisha Garland, who will talk about their role in the Revolutionary War.
My name is Jacob Van Fossen, and I was born in Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania on September 8, 1756. I am a fourth-generation American. My great-grandfather, Arnold Van Fossen, arrived in 1683 and helped found the city of Germantown, Pennsylvania. Growing up, I trained as a wheelwright and a cabinet maker. In July of 1776, I joined a volunteer group as an associator, later named the militia, that trained monthly to be ready to go at a minute's notice, kind of like a Minuteman. In September of 1776, we were called out to assemble and march to Philadelphia to join the regular Continental Army that had assembled under General George Washington. Under the leadership of Colonel John Bull, Major Rob Curry, and Adjutant William Armstrong, we marched from Philadelphia across New Jersey through Trenton, Princeton, Brunswick, and Amboy. When we got there, we began digging trenches and building earthworks as a defense versus the possible British invasion that could come from New York or Long Island. From our position, the British were encamped less than 600 yards across the Kill-Van Kull River that separates Staten Island from New Jersey. At various times during our stay, the British Continental Army and our own troops exchanged both cannon and long rifle fire across the river. During that time, we caught a local loyalist farmer who had been putting lye in the grain used to bake the bread for the army. The farmer was tried by jury, convicted, and hanged. Shortly after that, we remained at the fortifications until December, when the militia then returned to Pennsylvania.
I am Elisha Garland. I was born in June 1763 in Halifax County, North Carolina. I was 13 years old when I joined the Continental Army. I enlisted on January the 4th, 1777, as a private in the 3rd North Carolina Regiment. Initially, we were drilled by our captain on loading and firing muskets and military formations and movements. We were pushed in training to fire 4 musket rounds per minute. In July of 1777, our unit was ordered to march some 300 miles through Virginia to join General Washington's main army in Pennsylvania. We could march 14, 15 miles a day. Marching was how armies moved from location to location. A word about uniforms. When the war started, the Continental Congress moved quickly and chose a brown uniform color, but the brown color was never liked by the troops. Militia usually wore hunting shirts or homespun coats. Early in the war, the 3rd North Carolina wore a hunting shirt like the militia. The British wore red coats. It wasn't until 1779 that General Washington ordered that Continental Army uniforms consist of blue coats and white waistcoats to differ from the British. In June 1777, General Washington learned that British General Howe had a massive fleet of 267 ships that was boarding troops, horses, and supplies in Sandy Hook, New Jersey. By late July, he knew that it was heading south down the Atlantic coast. With this news, Washington marched his army of 11,000 troops to Wilmington, Delaware, which is about 20 miles north of where the British finally landed. Some 15,000 British troops landed in late August at the northern end of the Chesapeake Bay, about 55 miles southwest of Philadelphia. Washington and Howe anticipated a big battle was brewing as they marched around Delaware and Maryland and into Pennsylvania, scouting each other. They would soon meet near Brandywine Creek.
On September 8th, 1777, my 21st birthday, our militia was called to assemble at Wentz's Tavern. We marched to Chadford, Pennsylvania, to join the Continental Army. We were under the leadership of Major General John Armstrong. We were deployed along the Brandywine Creek south of the Philadelphia Road, covering General Washington's left flank, also guarding the Army's supply depot.
On this map of the Battle of Brandywine, the red shows British movements, while the blue shows Continental movements. On September the 9th, Washington moved his troops to the east side of Brandywine Creek. The British Army was camped at Kennett Square to the west across the creek. Early on September 11, we saw part of Howe's army getting ready for battle. Our regiment was stationed near Washington, and the Pennsylvania militia was south of us. Washington did not know at that time that the British had split their troops into two separate groups, with General Knyphausen to attack across the creek from the front, and Cornwallis to circle around and attack from our right flank. First fighting was near Welch's Tavern. After 2 to 3 hours, the British pushed the Continental troops across Brandywine Creek. Then for several hours, there was a big cannonade by both sides and very little troop movement. Cornwallis's troops had left at 5 in the morning in the fog. The 17-mile march took them about 9 hours as they went north and across the river. They crossed the Brandywine way above our right flank. They arrived at 2 p.m. They were exhausted and given time to eat and rest. Because of poor scouting, our army did not see them until 4 p.m. when they came up on the rear side of our right side. We were caught totally off guard by the British attack. Washington quickly moved troops from the center to counter Cornwallis, and hearing of the attack by Cornwallis, Knyphausen launched a British attack against the weakened American center across Chad's Ford, forcing the Continentals to retreat. There was a fierce battle. We were able to slow down the British, but Washington soon saw that he would likely be surrounded. He brought up reinforcements and was able to hold off Howe's column long enough for the army to escape. In the retreat, we had to abandon our 10 cannons and a howitzer because the artillery horses had been killed. We were ordered to march north and camp at Chester and regroup. We were lucky that the British did not pursue us. There were more troops at the Battle of Brandywine than any other battle of the Revolution. There were 18,000 British to our 11,000 Continentals.
The battle goes on from morning light until late afternoon. When the militia, we were told to gather our provisions and move north to White Marsh. For some days we were there, and during that time 2 more battles took place close to our position, but we were not engaged. After 2 days, we moved to the Schuylkill River at the Wissahickon Creek and take a position opposite the British camp. Following the American defeat at Brandywine, the British captured Philadelphia. British General Howe positioned 2 brigades and a contingent of Hessians north of the city in Germantown. Washington sensed an opportunity to attack and destroy the British at the Germantown encampment. On October the 3rd, we moved toward the town of Germantown, but we are slowed by a heavy fog of the early morning. It remains for most of the day, causing confusion and misinformation on the British movements. Washington set his plan into motion on the night of October the 3rd. He divided his army so as to attack the British from multiple directions at dawn. The army forms 4 columns from the Schuylkill River to Germantown city line. Militia on the left, 2 columns of regulars, and 1 militia on the flank. General John Sullivan would attack with the main force while General Nathaniel Greene attacked on the flank. The militia under General William Smallwood would target the British extreme right and rear. However, darkness and a heavy fog delayed the advance and cost Washington the element of surprise.
The British were shocked by the attack of Sullivan's large American force. Some of the British were cut off, and 120 men took shelter in the Benjamin Chew House. The Continentals made several attacks on the Chew House, but were driven back with heavy losses. A heavy fog had caused a great deal of confusion among the approaching Americans. General Wayne's division became separated in the fog. Sullivan's men had advanced past the Chew House and were beginning to run low on ammunition, so they withdrew. General Greene's column arrived in time to engage the British before they could rout Wayne's troops. Unfortunately, one of Greene's brigades also became lost in the fog and mistook Wayne's men for the British. They opened fire, Wayne's men returned fire, and the resulting firefight caused both units to break and flee the field when the British attacked. After several hours of fighting, our troops and the British both withdrew from the battle. The arrival of Greene's and Wayne's men and our artillery had prevented a total disaster. The 2 militia columns had only succeeded in diverting the attention of the British and had made no progress before they withdrew. Although we were defeated, the battle boosted our morale and our self-confidence. Washington's soldiers had performed well, and Germantown demonstrated that his once unskilled army was on its way to becoming a well-trained force.
After the Battle of Germantown, the army and the militia confronted the British early in December at Whitemarsh. There was no conclusion. At that time, the Pennsylvania militia companies returned home for the winter.
After Germantown, our Continental Army and the other militia units were involved in a number of smaller fights with the British, including Whitemarsh. Then we marched to Valley Forge for the winter. We arrived at Valley Forge 6 days before Christmas in 1777. We were hungry and tired. Many of our soldiers only had worn-out clothes, and some did not have shoes. They wrapped themselves in blankets to keep warm. They wrapped their feet in rags. We heard after we arrived that some 3,000 of our troops were unfit to serve because they were barefoot and otherwise naked. Valley Forge was going to be our home until June 1778. This is how Valley Forge was laid out. It was well located, could be easily defended. It was close enough to Philadelphia to watch the British, but far enough away to prevent them from making a surprise attack. As soon as we arrived, General Washington ordered the building of log huts for shelter. We also built miles of trenches, roads, and fortifications to be able to defend ourselves in case of a British attack. Our North Carolina regiments were in General McIntosh's brigade, and our camp was near Washington's headquarters. By February, the soldiers had built some 2,000 log huts to shelter the 12,000 soldiers and the 400 women and children that followed the army. The army cut down all the trees for 15 to 20 miles around Valley Forge to build the huts and to use for firewood. Food was scarce for the first 2 months. The army commissary was mismanaged, and Congress had not provided money for supplies. In February, Congress finally provided money. Soldiers cooked their own food with their hutmates, consisting of one meal a day, usually around 3 p.m., and we subsisted on something called fire cake, which was flour and water mixed together and baked in an iron kettle, or it was wrapped on sticks and placed by the fire to bake. Sometimes we had a spicy soup to go with our fire cake. It was made from small scraps of tripe and other meats and some peppercorns and vegetables. The lack of organization and food and money shortages plagued the Army, but the cold and the starvation were not the most dangerous threats at Valley Forge. There were all sorts of diseases. The most common sicknesses were flu, typhus, typhoid fever, and dysentery. All of this was made worse by the poor hygiene and sanitation at the camp. By the time we left in June, over 2,000 soldiers had died that winter. When soldiers became sick, they were taken to hospitals in nearby towns. Many of them died there and were buried locally. There would have been more deaths if we had not had dedicated surgeons, nurses, smallpox inoculations, and improved camp sanitation. There were about 400 women and children at Valley Forge. The wives of some of the officers and soldiers followed behind the Army. Women were under martial law just like any soldier, and they endured the same hardships and marches as the Army did. In addition to wives, many women followed the Army. General Washington prohibited women of questionable nature to accompany his army. The women and children were provided rations. Women received half of what a soldier got, and children were given quarter rations. Camp followers did basically domestic jobs, like washerwomen. Also, they worked as seamstresses, nurses, and cooks, and depending on the jobs they did, they could receive more rations. Martha Washington joined the general for part of each winter encampment he attended. She arrived at Valley Forge in the beginning of February and left in early June. Much of her time there was spent running the household at the general's headquarters, and her presence lifted the spirits of the officers and the men. Our Army had very few professional soldiers, although many had served in the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. The French Minister of War recommended Prussian military officer Friedrich von Steuben to Benjamin Franklin, who passed on word to Washington. On February the 23rd, 1778, von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge. General Washington was quickly impressed by his sharp military mind and skills and appointed him to be the Army's chief drill master. His Prussian drill techniques were far more advanced than those of other European armies, let alone those of the ragtag Patriot Army. Von Steuben also instituted hygiene standards in the filthy camp. Von Steuben didn't speak much English. He only knew a few curse words. He used interpreters to run the troops through all kinds of intense Prussian-style drills, often cursing them in English, German, and French. He taught us weapon skills, military formations, and movements to efficiently load, fire, and reload our muskets in about 12 seconds, how to launch bayonet attacks, how to use artillery, how to march in compact columns of 4 instead of miles-long single-file lines. By the end of June, we had become pretty well trained in proper military skills. Then Washington broke camp to pursue the British, who were abandoning Philadelphia.
In February of 1778, after learning that the Americans had defeated the British at the Battle of Saratoga, the French recognized the United States and declared war on Great Britain. That caused the British to give up the hopes of a military victory, and they adopted a defensive strategy. In May, General Clinton replaced General Howe as commander of the British troops. Clinton was ordered to evacuate Philadelphia and return to New York. On June 15th, the British began the evacuation of Philadelphia. When Washington learned of their movements, he sends a company under General Lafayette to chase and harass the British moving through New Jersey. That contingent was made up mostly of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania militia. Washington marched his army to catch Lafayette and the British. They joined near the town of Monmouth. Washington had sent a third of his army ahead under the command of General Charles Lee, who hoped to surprise the British. On June 28, 1778, General Lee attacked the British rear guard. His troops outnumbered the army by 2-1, but Lee had no confidence in his soldiers and did not press his advantage, and General Cornwallis took the initiative. It almost became a disaster. When Washington approached the fighting, he came across many panic-stricken troops fleeing the enemy. He was enraged, and he galloped ahead of his troops and removed Lee from his command. Washington rallied the troops that he had and continued to attack the British, which gave time for the rest of the army to get there and join the battle. Washington placed General Greene's division on the right and General Alexander's division on the left. Lee's men were turned over to Lafayette and kept in reserve. General Wayne assumed command over the other elements of Lee's force and manned Lafayette's front. Artillery was placed on both flanks, and the guns on the right were positioned to rain fire down on the British.
The American counterattack on the British right flank forced them to fall back. The intense fighting seesawed back and forth under the 100-degree June sun for several hours. By 6 p.m., however, the British felt that they had had enough. Wayne wanted to press the attack, but Washington did not. He believed his men were too beat out from the heat and fatigue. He planned to renew the fight the next morning. However, the British slipped away in the darkness and resumed their march to New York City. Monmouth was the biggest and the longest one-day battle of the war. Although it was tactically a draw, the battle was a strategic victory and a political triumph for the Continental Army and General Washington. The Army had proven itself to be much improved after its training it underwent over the winter at Valley Forge. The professional conduct of the American troops during that battle was widely noted by the British.
After Monmouth Courthouse, I returned home and I began my career as a county tax collector and a recruiter for the regular army. Around 1800, I moved my family to Augusta, Virginia, and began a new life with my brother John and his family. During my life, I am married 3 times. I have 6 children. 4 were born in Pennsylvania and 2 were born in Virginia. In 1845, I die of natural causes, and that's where I am buried.
After Monmouth Courthouse, I complete my enlistment and return to North Carolina. In 1781, I joined the North Carolina militia as a substitute for my brother, and I was with the militia at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina, led by General Nathaniel Greene. I married Lucy Reeves in December of 1783. We had 10 children, and we moved to Davidson County, Tennessee, and lived there the rest of our lives. I died there in 1836.
And that is the tale of 2 patriots in the American Revolution who fought together but never met each other. Jacob Van Fossen of the Pennsylvania Militia
and Elisha Garland of the 3rd North Carolina Regiment.